thank you again for having me here. I'm very happy to be presenting this work. And I want to start with saying that this is work that is still not published. So this is still in progress. It's under review right now. So think about it as, you know, bread that is not yet baked and not yet ready for to be sold, right? So I think it's an interesting thing when non-academics see how academics are developing their ideas and when they're presenting them. So I'm happy to hear your thoughts and what do you think about sort of the findings. So I'll start with a little bit talking about, just to give you, let me see, a little bit about myself. So who's this guy with this very long name? So my name is Ariel. I'm an associate professor at the Charles H. Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University. And as Donna was saying, that a lot of my research is looking at how extreme weather and climate change might be affecting the economy, particularly agriculture. I've been working in other sectors, you know, things that relate climate change with migration, or how extreme weather events affect nutrition in Africa, or how it's affecting trade, or even how it's affecting land use change. So a lot of focus, but a lot of my work is just focused on agriculture and the US and beyond. And the project today is gonna go beyond the US, okay? Although it has implications for the US. So before I start even talking about this, I wanted to spend some time talking about climate change. Before we get to the impacts of climate change, let's talk a little bit about climate change and what the science says about this. So I'll try to be a little bit brief about this. But maybe some of you have seen graphs like this, where you can see how depending on the emissions that humans put out in the atmosphere, we might get different worlds with more or less warming in the coming decades. So these are the scenarios like RCP 8.5. It means that this is a scenario where, you know, we continue to emit greenhouse gases at a very rapid pace. And there's scenarios like the RCP 2.6, which are you know, sort of stabilizing our emissions or going transitioning to renewable energy, and we stabilize the global temperature at a lower level. A lot of the work in academia is focusing on that future, right? The trade-offs between, you know, what do we have to lose between these different worlds, and everything's forward-looking. However, one thing that we are not generally thinking enough about, at least in the field that I'm working in, is what has already happened, okay? This line here, the line that you see here in the global temperatures, right? It's not flat, okay? The future looks very uncertain, but when we look at the past, this is not a flat line. So the climate has already changed. And maybe we don't appreciate it in this figure, but when we zoom in, since the start of the Industrial Revolution, temperatures have risen by about 1 degree over the entire globe, and that includes over land and oceans. And the trends are even stronger over land than over oceans. So this is even hiding where we are living, right? We're living over land. So it doesn't really matter what type of data sets you use. All the instrumental records, so this is using thermometers. So we have records going back a long time, and the trend is very clear. And it's not only very clear, but when you use different sources of data, you see that snapshot that I got you coming from the 19th century to today is now here represented in red. So when we look back almost like 2,000 years of other records from, cores of trees. So these are different types of records, right? We didn't have thermometers. We don't have the same technology. 2,000 years ago, we didn't have thermometers. So climate scientists study very old trees, and they try to back out sort of how warm things were back in the day. And even when we go back 2,000 years, the rising temperatures that we're observing since particularly the mid 20th century is unprecedented in the past 2,000 years. Okay, so this is unprecedented changes in temperature at the global scale. Okay, so this is not something that, oh, it was warm before. Well, not at this scale, and not this, and the change is not as rapid as we're seeing here in a matter of a few decades. And when you see what has changed that might explain this is, well, look at this. This is carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. So the way that you measure that is you go and dig very deep for ice in ice cores. There's little bubbles trapped in that ice, and you can measure how much carbon dioxide there was a long time ago. We're talking about thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And what we see is that there's way more carbon dioxide now in the atmosphere. So you see the peak here that coincides with the fact that we're now starting to use fossil fuels, right? So that started not too long ago in a scale like this, right? So thinking about almost 1 million years ago. So we're looking at an unprecedented change in greenhouse gases. And these emissions have exploded after the Second World War, right? And now it's not only just, say, the US and Europe who are driving this, which was mainly what was happening before the Second World War. Now things are changing. We have developing countries, middle-income countries like China, and India that are playing a role in the total emissions that we're putting out every year. And the rise is staggering, okay? So this is, you just imagine, it's 7 times more the emissions that we were having right after the Second World War, okay? So a lot of greenhouse gases are being emitted every day, every year since then. So how do we know that these emissions have something to do with these trends, right? How do we know? There's many sources of evidence, right? And I'm just going to give you one piece of evidence. And I'm going to give you that piece of evidence because it's one that I'm going to rely on in this study. And it's that climate scientists use climate models to model the long-term behavior of the climate system. So think about it as your weather forecast models, right? Where you can see how good the weather is going to be in the next couple of weeks. The same type of model, right, with not as fine resolution, but with coarser resolution, can be are used in climate science to go back and try to recreate or replicate our current climate system and see how, say, the eruption of a volcano might change the climate system for a couple of years, things like that, right? So not only human forces, but also natural influence into the climate system. And what you're seeing here in orange, right, is a suite of models. So this is an ensemble, it's a group of models from all over the world. So there's Chinese models, or US models, European models, Norwegian models, Japanese, there's about more than 20 models, different groups of climate scientists around the world who are developing these models and trying to see how the global temperature might be changing over time if you have human influence, if you have emissions coming in and emissions that are creating the greenhouse gas effect and warming the temperature. So you can see that it's showing, all these models are showing, the average here is in orange, in solid orange, is that the temperatures are starting particularly to rise after the Second World War with a little bit of a lag around the 60s. So you see a sort of a takeoff here of global temperatures that are about now even more than 1 degree. Now, why am I showing you this? Is that when you look at the observations, so what I showed you here, these are not models. These are measurements in thermometers, right? So when you take those measurements and put them on top of what the climate models are saying, the black line is the observations. They fall in line with what the models are saying about the changing global temperatures, okay? So and there's things like these models replicate things like volcanic eruption. So in the early 60s and in the 90s, you see these dips here, and the orange lines are dipping. Those are major volcanic eruptions that sort of shielded the world a little bit and cooled the world for just a year or two. So you pick that up, both in the observations, but also in the climate models. So the great thing about a climate model is that you can run an experiment. We cannot go back in time and put the and high carbon dioxide. We can not with the real world. What we can do is use these climate models and say remove carbon dioxide from the models, right? So all these greenhouse emissions. And when climate modelers do that, you get a different version of the world, which is one where temperatures would have remained more stable, okay? And you see that the observations that we see here going up fall outside the range of what the models point out would have been the world if we didn't have greenhouse gases from humans, okay? So this is one of the pieces of evidence that climate scientists use. There's a lot more, okay? I'm not gonna spend time on those, but everything's consistent with the fact that it's human influence that is the cause of all these recent trends in global temperatures. Okay, so, and we're going to rely on this actually for this study. So I don't want to spend, so beat this this argument to death, but there's all overwhelming consensus that it's coming from humans, whether we like it or not. That's where the whole consensus is pointing to. And for those who not necessarily know how academia works, like there's great incentives for someone trying to disprove anything that everyone believes, and it's just it simply just sometimes I hear like there's as if there's a conspiracy theory about all the academics getting together and thinking about we're going to come up with this that's wait, if you've been in a faculty meeting, you know that it's it's very difficult to get people to agree. I don't so just saying that there's no real argument here regarding this. So the question is, has this impacted agriculture, right? And when I say agriculture, I don't only mean crop yields, because a lot of the work in the economic literature is looking just at cereals, right? So especially work that is looking at global impacts, it's looking at rice, wheat, maize, primarily, and there's way more in agricultural production than just those cereal crops. Here, there's this data from FAO, and showing that those cereal crops, all of the cereal crops, represent about 20% of the total global value of production. So you have a lot more things going on in the agricultural sector than just crop yield. So in this study, we're going to try to look at the entire agricultural system. And in that effort to try to look at the entire agricultural system, right? So with all its diversity, from tree crops to livestock, dairy, everything will be in our analysis. In order to do that, we use a metric that economists use a lot. It's called total factor productivity. And it's a metric that, instead of, maybe you're more familiar with like crop yield, right? Or labor productivity. So those are all partial productivity measures. So you take a level of output, say, how many bushels did you produce? And then you divide by one of the inputs. One of the inputs in the case of, say, corn would be land. So you take output divided by one input, and it gives you crop yields. But the level of crop yield doesn't really tell you what is happening with the other inputs. Did they put a lot of fertilizer in? What other things came in? Was it there a lot of labor? And so you can have very high crop yields, and you don't know if it's maybe they're putting a lot of fertilizer, or maybe it's great, great technology, and you get this higher yield just because the plant is better at absorbing water and the nutrients. So this metric is trying to capture all of that. So instead of being a return to one input, it's a return to all inputs that we can measure, at least. So labor, land, materials, capital, all of that is aggregated into an aggregate input that you see here in the US has been relatively stable. So this is TFP data for the US. So it is usually US agriculture. See that the total ag input has remained relatively stable. The mix has changed. So agriculture has changed tremendously, but the overall, when you aggregate it all, it's remained fairly stable in the US since the 1950s. However, output, so when you aggregate all the output, everything from milk to corn, so everything that comes out of the agricultural sector, you aggregate it, and that output has been rising, right? So if you have inputs that are stable, output is rising, where is it coming from, right? It has to come from something we call total factor productivity. So there's something is happening that we're more productive, right? So that is what you see here in orange, right? So that's a total factor productivity for US agriculture. And one critical part of this metric that embodies the entire productivity of the US agricultural sector is that it doesn't have weather in it, right? Weather is extremely important for agricultural production, but it's not measured by the US government. Well, it is measured, right? But they have measurements, but they don't incorporate them into these productivity metrics that the US Department of Agriculture issues. So you can see, so if you look at the TFP data, you see 83, you see a big dip in productivity. You go to 1988, you see a big dip, a dip too. 2012, you see a big dip. 93, you see a dip also in productivity here. And that is just weather. Those are droughts or floods that were not accounted for. And the agricultural sector simply looks less productive in years like that. It's just because there's a weather variable that is omitted from these productivity metrics. So that's exactly sort of the loophole in the way that the data is put together that we're going to harness, okay? So talking more about productivity, TFP, the USDA also puts out country level productivity estimates for most countries in the world. And to see is that productivity has been rising fairly rapidly in some countries like Brazil and China. The US productivity growth is fairly high. It's among the highest in the world. It's fairly high, but there's a whole group of countries, low-income countries, even transition economies in Eastern Europe, that are growing much slower than say the US and some European countries or Brazil and China. Okay, and you see a map here of where are places, especially like in sub-Saharan Africa, where growth in productivity is relatively slow relative to what we are experiencing here in the US. Now, this is aggregate for the US. What you're seeing here in the blue, in the teal color, there's a lot of variation within the US, right? So there's states that are growing much faster than other states. Okay, so this is hiding a lot of heterogeneity within the country. So we're going to be using data like this, where we are capturing the productivity growth for the agricultural sector for every country that we have data on. So the question that we're going to be tackling is, how much has anthropogenic climate change, when I say anthropogenic climate change, is a climate change that comes from human influences, not from natural sources, the part that comes from human influences, how much has it already affected global agricultural productivity? That's really our research question. So what we're going to do, three, our approach is going to be, it will consist on 3 steps. So first, we want to know how agriculture responds to weather fluctuations, okay? Broadly speaking, when it's dry or hot, what happens to that productivity measure that embodies all the sectors in a particular country? Is it, does it go up or down? You're trying to characterize how agriculture at an aggregate scale, the sector responds to these changes in weather. The second one is that we need to create an alternative world, right? We need to come up with what would have been the weather like without human influence in the climate system. So for that, we team up with climate scientists. So there's 2 climate scientists as co-authors in the paper, and they're both at Cornell, and they give us from that suite of models, they'll give us that information on how do you, the world with anthropogenic climate change and the world without anthropogenic climate change. And then we combine these two results to simulate what would have been the growth of total factor productivity in a world with anthropogenic climate change and the world without anthropogenic climate change. And then by looking at the difference, we can back out the influence since the 1960s, which is what we're going to do. So graphically, the first step is this. We're going to have weather fluctuations that we're going to try to understand how that weather affects that outcome variable that is total factor productivity, or TFP. So we're going to try to estimate a statistical relationship, an econometric relationship between weather, how the weather affects changes in TFP. Okay, and there's going to be some uncertainty around that that curve. Okay, the second step now is to take this global climate model, general circulation models that have many layers, and then you need a supercomputer to run these models, and those models are going to spit out different weather trajectories in those two worlds. The one that tries to replicate our current world that you see here in red, and the world without anthropogenic climate change and human influences, which is here in blue. So this is how the data looks like. So on the left, you have, that's a Hadley model. It's one of the models that we use. And what you see is that the one on the left has human forcing, so human influence in them. And you see the temperature starts to, global temperature that you see at the bottom is rising. On the right, it's the same model, but you just remove the ability of greenhouse gases to affect the climate system. So you see that temperatures remain low. So these are this is a way that we're going to recreate those hypothetical worlds in which we sort of remove our influence on the climate system. Okay. So we're going to combine these two steps, that statistical approach that I mentioned, to try to see how weather responds to, how agriculture responds to weather fluctuations, and how the different climate models tell us about what would have been the weather in two different worlds, one with humans affecting the climate system and one without humans affecting the climate system. So that combines both the statistical uncertainty from how agriculture responds to these weather shocks, but also the climate uncertainty coming from our understanding of how much greenhouse gases affect the climate, right? So that different models will give you slightly different levels of warming. So that is also captured in our analysis. Okay, how am I doing? Okay, I have 8 minutes. So in terms of the data, we use data from USDA, from ERS, the Economic Research Service, and the data goes back from 1961 to 2015. I'm not going to go over all the details in the data. I generally do, when I do an academic presentation, I spend more time describing all these data sets. But there's data on productivity, aggregate agricultural productivity for more than, so now the sample that we have is 172 countries, and so almost every country in the world is represented in the data that we use. Okay, the weather data that we use is a gridded product that covers the entire world. It has a fairly high resolution spatially, about like 25 kilometers in resolution. Here I'm showing how the weather data looks, say, from a country like France. And so we have like weather observations for each one of these little grids. And we have that for the whole world since 1948. So it's a lot of information. And however, our analysis is at the country level, not at the fine scale grid cell level. So what we do is that we have to aggregate up this weather data to each country, right? And the way that we aggregate it is not at random. We aggregate depending on where agriculture, so either cropland, pastures, are located within a country. So you see here the map with the cropland map tells us how much cropland there is in each one of these little grids, and we use those as aggregation to go up to the level of the country, where that's where our analysis is based. One thing that we do is that the tricky part is, when is the weather relevant? What's a relevant weather for each country? And one part of the analysis that we did was looking at the whole year, January to December. But anyone who knows a little bit of agriculture knows that the timing is everything, right? That you really need to know when the weather conditions are happening to know how it might be affecting agriculture. So timing is very important, especially for crop production or tree, or fruit production. Perhaps less so to some extent for livestock. But here we have everything, all the sectors. So even think about the timing is a little bit, could be misleading, because crops is just a share of the total output that we're looking at. But we did something trying to hone in on when agricultural production might be occurring, or what are the windows in the year that might be most important for each country. And so what we did is that we use NDVI data. So this is like greenness data taken from satellites, and we back out what is the greenest month in each location around the world, right? Like where do we get the peak in greenness? And then we construct our windows to think about the timing for weather conditions for each country based on that green window, right? So if you look at the US Midwest or here in the Northeast, it's in the summer, right? So you see July, it's the greenest month here. So this is not surprising for us, but look at how variable it is across the world. So we account for that enormous heterogeneity in when things are green across the world. So we use that also in our analysis. And for the weather trajectories, we use a CMIP6, which is just the latest sort of suite of climate models. And we're using 7 climate models at the moment to do this with the 2 experiments, the historical one that replicates our climate system with human influence, and the IST-NAT one, which represents a climate system when you remove human influence from the climate system. Okay, so that's what we use. And now let me jump to the results. Okay, so this is the only equation in the presentation, and it really captures our analysis. So this is the relationship between, so this is TFP that we estimate, and these are the temperature, we use our weather conditions or temperature and precipitation. We use a variety of different combinations, minimum temperature, maximum temperature, average temperature, and sometimes we include precipitation or exclude precipitation. There's different ways, and then we try to account for other confounding factors through dummy variables in the statistical analysis. And there might be measurement error. Those are things that we do not capture, so that those things end up in the error term in our statistical analysis, and it helps give us a sense of how uncertain our statistical relationship is. So when we do this analysis, this is what we find for our main model. On the left, you see the response function for temperature, and on the right, you see the response function for precipitation. And what we find at a global scale is that, you see, this is downward sloping, okay? So what this is saying is that as temperatures rise, we find a relationship that says that as temperatures rise, productivity tends to be lower. So years, okay, I'm not saying that it's warm areas, right? So the thought experiment is that not warm areas have lower productivity, is in any given place, when a year is warmer, you tend to see lower productivity. That's what it means, this negative, this downward sloping curve. For precipitation, is more, it's more like a hill-shaped relationship where lower levels of precipitation might be detrimental, or very high levels of precipitation might be detrimental. And this is all at the global scale. One interesting finding is that we find that this relationship is changing over time. So when we look at the second half of the sample, we find that global agricultural productivity is becoming increasingly sensitive to these high temperatures. Not that temperatures are already rising, but every time you have a hotter summer, hotter conditions, it is becoming more damaging, right? And this is very curious. We don't know exactly what might be happening here at the global scale. But in a previous study for the US, and you can get access to the paper and then the press release here, we find a similar pattern in US agriculture, where US agriculture is becoming increasingly sensitive to these high temperatures, particularly in the Midwest. And we find that it has to do with 2 things. One of them is specialization. So the Midwest is specializing more into crop production than it did in the 60s. And that is driving part of that fact that every time there's a drought or a heat wave, you lose more, you get a bigger hit from the same weather shock. Okay, so this is a kind of the key results, summarizing the kind of the results of the study, and is that we combine that statistical model with all these hypothetical worlds with and without climate change from humans, and we see that since the 1960s, right, what we see is that on average we find that global agricultural productivity has been reduced by about 20%, right, with a fairly wide confidence band, right? So it's not a very precise estimate, but about 20% loss in global agricultural productivity since the 1960s. This is way higher than I anticipated when I started working on this. I thought like, well, maybe we're gonna get like 5%, or just because livestock is such, very important. And I was very surprised because this is a big number. When you think about it in terms of levels, what we're seeing global agricultural productivity is this red band, this red line. What could have been without anthropogenic climate change is what we see in this gray band or in this blue band. So productivity growth would have been faster in a world without human influences in the climate system. And one way to think about this is that the level that we reached this year, 2020, right, in agricultural productivity, would have been reached in 2011 without human forcing, right? So if you start in 1960, instead of reaching it in 2020, we would have reached in 2011. So that means that anthropogenic climate change has wiped out 9 years of productivity growth over the past 60 years, okay, which is fairly substantial. So imagine all the research and development that is being spent to growing. So it's starting to function as a headwind to global agricultural production. In the study, we also look at differences across countries. The countries that are most impacted are in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean, which are warmer areas to begin with. So the impacts are larger there. And they're milder in temperature areas in the northern hemisphere, but they're still negative. Okay, so we're actually also trying to work on a study looking at U.S. agriculture in particular, looking at different regions in the U.S. and try to do a similar study to see how things are being affected, have been affected in the U.S. already. So that's another one. I won't spend too much time just to just tell you that that model that I just showed you with the response functions and everything is just one model, right? And there's assumptions that we make. So the model that we use as average temperature, included precipitation, had a symmetric response curve. So there's a bunch of modeling assumptions that we put, but we try all the combinations of models just to show that we didn't cherry pick our model. And when you showed our model, the one that I showed you before, all the results that I show you are here represented in blue. And these are negative, right? So this is zero effect, and this is like minus 20% the number minus 20%. Look at all the other possible variations of the model. They're all around, they're all negative, right? So it's not like we cherry pick one model and just found some negative result and ran with it. No matter what model we use, we get negative results that are fairly substantial. Okay, so that's what I wanted to show you. So here there's like 200 different models. So in conclusion for the study, this is kind of the summary of what we found, is that yes, anthropogenic climate change has affected global agricultural productivity. We find it's like a 20% drop since the 1960s, and it's equivalent to losing about 9 years of productivity growth, which is substantial. And the impacts are larger in warm countries. And interestingly, global agriculture is increasingly sensitive to warmer temperatures. So I don't want to end with just kind of sounds like sounds maybe a little bit might be scary, but there's opportunities here that I wanted to highlight. And is that obviously, think about adaptation. We have to adapt to this new world. Adaptation doesn't necessarily come just from farmers. There's a lot of R&D that needs to happen to get the right technology in place so that farmers can cope with these extremes. It's a complex connection of activities that need to happen for an efficient adaptation to a changing climate. But there's also things on the mitigation side. So when you think about sources of greenhouse gases, about a quarter come from agriculture broadly defined, okay? This is at the global scale. So a quarter come from things that have to do with food production, a quarter, okay? It's not only factories and cars, it's agriculture has a major global role to play and if we want to mitigate climate change, okay? When you look at the US, right, about 8% of the emissions come from food and agricultural production. New York State is about 4%. So it is not 25, but it's fairly substantial still, right? And there's a new law, maybe some of you are aware of, this is when it was a bill. So there's a law, this was already signed into law by the governor. And New York State has a very ambitious program to mitigate climate change, right? So it's trying to transform some of the key points about this bill is to try to completely wipe out the emissions from greenhouse gases by 2050. Okay, that's around the corner. That's 30 years away. That's not too far away to go to zero emissions. And so in this law, what happened is it's already a law. There's a climate action council. There's advisory panels, right? And one of those advisory panels also, deal with agriculture, right? So one of the things that you can see here in the bill is that these panels should be proposing regulatory measures or meet goals or thinking about mechanisms to get the agricultural sector involved through, say, measures to achieve carbon sequestration and or promote best management practices in land use, agriculture, and forestry. So there's opportunities there, and there's right now people working on that. So if this is something that these are opportunities that people in the food and agricultural sector in New York State should be aware of, that it's happening right now. So there might be opportunities for the sector. So that's what I have for today. Thank you so much for your time. You can shoot me an email or follow me on Twitter, and where I go on rants about reviewers rejecting my papers. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ariel. There, when he quits sharing, look at that, right on time. So let me share my screen so that you guys can evaluate his presentation while we take questions. All right. Donna, can you see that now?
Yes, yep, it's up. It looks good.
Super. Well,
that was an excellent presentation. I thank you very much for that. I'll give a quick reminder that you can scan the QR code with your camera, and it should take you to a link to evaluate the presentation. And we'd appreciate that if everyone would do it. So I have a question, and it feels like, coming from the dairy industry, cows have gotten a lot of blame, or there's a lot of concern about cows as contributors to methane gases. And I'm trying really hard when I see that agriculture is responsible for 4% of greenhouse gas emissions in New York State. So, I think we have to take that. We still have to take that very seriously, because even though it's a small percentage, we need to do our part to reduce it. How do we get people, legislators, consumers, the general public, to focus on the areas that are the biggest contributors?
So here's my take on this. I think that yes, it's only 4% in your state, right? So that's relatively low, and what I think is that you need to be proactive. That would be my take, and highlight, and not be in the defense, but in the offense regarding these matters. what I think what I think is that the agricultural sector, not only in New York, everywhere, would benefit tremendously if there were mechanisms, right? Like market mechanisms that allow people to be rewarded for mitigating emissions, right? So
That's such a
that's
big
it's
deal.
central. That's central. That has to be part of a policy, but it cannot be sort of command and control. So say, no, you cannot do this, you cannot do that. Like that's a recipe for disaster when the government generally comes in and tries to pick winners and losers. That approach, you can actually reduce emissions in a cheaper way if you allow for people to say, well, if it's too difficult to reduce emissions from cattle production, then allow other sectors where it's cheaper to reduce those emissions, right? At the end of the day, the emissions, they mix up and they're as damaging no matter what, where they come from. So you want to reduce those emissions in the cheapest way possible. And there's areas where it's much cheaper to reduce emissions than from others, right? And that is across sectors. So it might be easier to, cheaper to retrofit buildings, for instance, than to cut emissions from, other sources. So those costs are known at an aggregate level, but even within the agricultural sector, there's a lot of variation in how cheap it is to reduce emissions. So any mechanism that allows for the cheapest way to win and to be able to be put forward are things that that should be encouraged and demanded, right? And so that's what I encourage is that to try to see that agriculture is part of a system, and then you should allow for trade to happen between the agricultural sector and other sectors that are mitigating, so that we get the reductions in the cheapest way possible. How is that reached? It could be through offsets, carbon offsets, or different ways that one can achieve this. But I think having people have that mentality and trying to push that way of thinking might drive us away from just sort of putting certain sectors as evil sectors because they're polluting a lot, right? There's nothing intrinsically bad with with being a polluter. You want to do it, but if it's too expensive, it'll drive you out of business, right? There's technologies that take time to develop that might help you do that. And you need incentives for people to come up with those new technologies. So innovation doesn't happen on its own. If it's cheap to pollute, people will pollute because
Right.
And so if it is more expensive to pollute, then the system will come up over time, not from one day to the next, but over time will come up with ways for you to pollute it a cheaper way, right? So reduce pollution and achieve that in a cheaper way. So I don't know if that's the answer, but I think that ultimately the system that we want is one where farmers are part of a system where you can allocate where those reductions will be coming from, and not from a top-down approach where you say the ag sector has to reduce this, or where it's less like a menu of things that you have to do, and more like, okay, if we do this, then you compensate me this way, where it's a service, right, that you're providing. So I think that would help move forward.
I also think what I really enjoyed about your presentation, besides like the really great data at the beginning showing changes over time, that was really fascinating, because we know, and there might be even members on this call who don't believe in climate change, right? That is one of, I think, the biggest challenges is people that don't believe in it. And I think what struck me about your presentation was highlighting what ag is losing by not addressing it.
Right.
It's not like ignoring it doesn't mean we're not losing. We're clearly losing production. I mean, I think you even said, when I started this, I did not think that number was going to be that high.
Yeah.
And so I guess what I would like to ask you as a question then is, and to your point about the need to work together, right? Like if it's cheaper to reduce it in transportation, let's reduce it in transportation so ag's less effective. So I guess my question to you is, I know what I think in my own head, but what do you think are the top 3 biggest challenges to getting stuff done? I mean, is it lack of belief? Is it lack of coordination? Is it lack of collaboration? What do you put in that box? And then if you pick something, I'm gonna make it hard on you. If you pick something, then give me an idea of what you think a solution might be.
Okay. So let me so I'll tackle it at the U.S. level, federal level. In general, there's plans. So California has a plan. New York State has a plan. The issue with the state initiatives is that we're talking about a problem that is global, and no single state on its own can really solve the problem, or cities, right? So the federal level needs to be all in this, on this. Otherwise, it's just going to be some states taking some actions who they're getting some advantages, because eventually the federal government will step in, and the states who have already made some progress will be in a better position, right? So I think the federal level is a must. There's already bipartisan agreements into how to come up with a system that is like a carbon tax. There's a group in DC called the Citizens Climate Lobby, and it's a nonpartisan group, and they've been building coalition over time, over many years, of Republicans and Democrats coming up with a system that they call carbon dividend. So it wouldn't be a system like tax is like a swear word. No one wants taxes. So the idea is to have a carbon dividend, where what it means is that you put a tax on carbon. Effectively, it's a tax on carbon. So things would be, everything that is in the short run based on fossil fuels will be slightly more expensive. And what happens is that money that is raised from that tax is returned to the US taxpayer as a check. You cut a check to every person in the US who pays taxes, and that's your carbon check, right? I don't see any, you'll get climate champions everywhere. Even the people who don't don't believe in climate change, when they get the check on the mail, it'll change. You'll get a lot of fans that are a fan of that policy. So I think there's a deadlock, there's a gridlock now, but you just, if that goes through and cooler heads and prevail, right, which actually exist on both sides of the aisle. If something like that goes through, because there's already a bill that was introduced, right, the HR 87 or 80, I forget exactly what but the Republicans are not going right now, with the Senate are not going to go through it. And the president's not going to sign that. This president's not. So I think you need both sides and a little bit of the. I don't see it right now, given all the tensions, the polarization in our system. But when we go beyond that curve, when we start going a little bit down in terms of the heat in the discussions, I think we'll get a movement at the federal level there, and then the rest is history. Once you get that in, people are getting their carbon dividend in the mail. There's no turning back. There's no turning back. And it's all about, how do you take advantage of these new markets that are emerging, right? So there's going to be developers wanting to install, wind turbines and solar panels here and there. There's going to be benefits if you do certain practices that reduce emissions. There's all these mechanisms will be associated with something like that. So, but it's important to bring the markets in and not have a system where you just pick, okay, we're going to fund this no matter what, or it cannot be something like that. You need to harness sort of the market forces to reduce these emissions. So I think it is possible. I'm kind of cautiously optimistic about the prospects, but you need to harness the markets. And sometimes I feel like on the very left, on the Democratic Party, they don't embrace markets in the same way that people more in the center on the right would be. And I think it's a pity that that's also happening, right? So it's the extremes are too loud. That would be my opinion. And I don't know. Did I answer the question?
Betsy, it was your question. I think it was answered.
Yeah, no, it was answered. I was going to let you go to that. Thank you very much, Ariel. That was, I think, a great finding out that there's plans already. That's always optimistic to find out there's things already. I was going to let Donna go to the open questions.
Yep, sounds good. So we do have two questions that came in on the Q&A from Holly McIntyre. Hi, Holly. There are other states that have also enacted laws to reduce, or are there other states that have also enacted laws to reduce or eliminate emissions? And if so, what time frame are those aimed at, and have they offered incentives?
Yes, I don't have all the details, but California is definitely one. They have a climate plan. New York has one. There might be other states in the Northeast that have implemented this plans, but China just released like a couple of days ago a plan to go to remove it by 2040, more aggressive than the U.S. It beat the U.S. to claim that they're going to go carbon neutral by in 2 decades, right? So we're falling behind in a sense in terms of just thinking about where we're going. Not even, we are not even, the federal government is behind internationally and what's happening. What might happen I think what's important is that these incentives are really important because you don't get people putting money to come up with new businesses that are in that, and all the innovation that needs to happen. It doesn't happen if there's not a return to that type of business. And if there's no incentives at the federal level where doing this with carbon is more expensive if you do it this way than going this other route, then you won't get the innovation. And then we might be buying the technology from other countries. So that's what might happen, right? So yes, so there's a couple plans at the state level, but at the end of the day, the federal level is going to has to kick in.
Good. I'm just gonna, and then the second question that came in from Chris Hilkema was on the same topic as methane gas given off by cows. I think it's important to be looking at the correct data. I heard on a podcast this morning that the total methane and CO2 emissions from cows is 1.9% versus 26% for cars, but some data will show emissions from the life cycle of the cow, but not the total life cycle of the car, giving the appearance of a larger impact by the cow and vilifying agriculture.
That's it's not a question, but I agree with that there's a lot of vilification going on, and the solution to that is being proactive, right? Having a strategy, a communication strategy that sort of addresses this, right? That tackles this myth, right? And any issues, and if there's things that the agricultural sector is doing or seeking or striving to do, and it might be things that take decades, right? So having new breeds that don't emit as much methane, then say that that's in the books, right? So it's part of the product. It's part of the milk that people buy. These are cows that are getting greener, right? That are not. We're working with researchers trying to come up with engineering how the gut of the cow and trying to find ways to reduce emissions for so the cows of the 21st century, right? So I think it's all about being proactive and being less on the defense, and more proactive about really what are the responsibilities and where they lie, right? So that's what I encourage everyone to be working on.
I think that's a very good answer. I don't know if you're aware, Burger King just released a commercial that said that if you feed the cows lemongrass, that their emissions are reduced. And I'm sorry to make this so much about cows. As Betsy said, this is kind of There's a lot of dairy here, but it really offended so many farmers, and it was too bad, because I don't think that their intent was to offend farmers or to create controversy, but it set the movement back, and that it's just so unfortunate that the people who might have been open to it before are now dug in and not happy, and that we can't do that. We can't do that. So
that's great. That's a great point. But so Burger King has their own incentives, but farmers as a group have their own. They have to be proactive about how do you want your clients to be talking about meat.
Right.
So you have to be nudging them and pushing them. It's like, there are ways that you can talk about this and not just wait for them to offend you, right? You have to go and say, like, this is how we think you should talk about meat and about milk, right?
Right. Yeah.
So that's way more proactive. And I think that it needs that because otherwise then people are cornered, right? You push people into a corner, right? And that's not going to then you set back any progress, right? When you get these things in the way.
Yeah, I think it's so unfortunate because it didn't help. So.
Well, I do think, again, I think having science, having data to have an open discussion. I mean, I think, again, that chart you showed of where the pollution is coming from, right? Mm-hmm. That's what the data shows. You've got to talk about where the data is. And I loved your answer to thinking strategically. Growers, farmers, doesn't matter what kind of farmer, dairy cow, fruit and vegetable, I don't care who you are, they're businessmen. They understand the economics of it. And what I liked about your answer there was we have to think strategically across the board. We can't focus on one sector because the answer may not lie in one sector, right? Yeah. We have to think about where do we make the changes that are most economically efficient, but it's got to be done. I mean, I think that's what really struck me about your answer and about your data as a whole was that it isn't about necessarily throwing blame. Like you said, polluting isn't a blame thing. It's just something you have to deal with, right? And getting to that discussion where people aren't so defensive about it and we're just making the changes to deal with it, I think is so important.
Yes. Polluting is a byproduct of something wonderful that is a productive activity. We don't pollute because we want to, right? It's just a byproduct. And there's ways to reduce pollution, but they're costly. And we shouldn't be just trying to reduce pollution in the, in places that, that are just more visible, right? We have to, as a society, think about, okay, how do we have this issue? How do we get it done in the cheapest way possible? And there are market mechanisms to try to achieve that. So I think that's where we need that. It's not just, okay, here's a menu of things that everyone has to do. It's more like, let the people sort it out. Let the market, the businessmen making decisions. But you need those rules of the game to be set, right? You need the rules of the game to be set because people are not going to do them willingly because they're costly and that puts them at a disadvantage. So you need a level playing field where, there's a clear signal that there's some things that are not desirable and people will do less of them and trying to find ways of reducing emissions, right? So that I think is very important, right?
Good. Well, I think that's an optimistic message and I'm glad to have that. So great. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your talk and for joining us. And yes, we'll.
Thank you for having me.